Before we go to the rest of the book of Genesis, let me just call your attention on page 28 of your reading. Once again, there is a box there right smack in the middle. And as you look at that box, you will notice that these three promises, the promises of Genesis 12 and of Genesis 17, are really followed through in the rest of the Pentateuch, in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. If you want some kind of structuring guide as to what's going on in the 5 books of Moses, here it is. And that is that they are all grounded in the 3 promises to Abraham. The Genesis 12, 1-3, in a real sense, becomes the hinge of the entire Pentateuch. The promises to Abraham look back on creation and the fall, but the promises to Abraham also look forward to what God was doing for the nation. And in the book of Genesis, God focuses on the promise of many descendants and shows how he fulfilled that promise through some challenges. In Exodus and Leviticus, the focus is on the relationship between God and the people. God removes them from Egypt so that they can be dedicated to him as their true ruler. And then in Numbers and Deuteronomy, the focus moves to the land. So that's a summary, and I want to look a little bit at the details before we complete this particular lecture. So when you get to the book of Genesis, after the promises to Abraham, it seems to me that what we see is a life of frustration. Abraham's life must have been frustrating. Perhaps one of the reasons he's a hero of faith is that he needed a lot of it. God promised him some incredible things. I will make your name great. I will make you have many descendants. You will be the father of many nations. You will rule this land. Okay, these are promises made to Abraham. And what's the reality? The reality is that none of them were particularly fulfilled within the lifetime of Abraham. For example, as you go through the book of Genesis, the wives, the chief wives of all the patriarchs were barren. Abraham's wife Sarai, later Sarah, Isaac's wife Rebekah, and Jacob's wife Rachel, all of them were barren. And it was a great struggle for them to have children, and they were limited in numbers. There was sibling rivalry. Ishmael against Isaac, Jacob against Esau, Joseph against his brothers, and or more in reverse, I suppose. But you have threats to this many descendants that God promised. There are famines in chapter 12, 26, and 41. 3 famines are mentioned in simply the story of the patriarchs. So on all 3 of those occasions, they had to leave the land for a while. The famine was severe enough. So instead of abundance coming out of these 3 promises to Abraham, in Abraham's experience, and even in his son and grandson's experience, a lot of this is never quite fulfilled. As a result, we see the patriarchs doing expedients, like maybe Lot can be my son. Maybe Eliezer, my servant, can be my son. Maybe Hagar can have a son for Sarah. Lord, why don't you accept Esau? There's a number of ways in which you're recognizing that the patriarchs are pretty frustrated, and they're struggling to understand how these promises God made were going to be worked out. In fact, when Abraham dies, he basically has Isaac and Ishmael as sons that to some degree can fulfill the promise. He basically owns none of the land except a grave for himself and his wife. So his domination of the land never quite happens. And some of the blessings in his relationship with God certainly didn't seem all that clear. Was he a blessing to the nations? Seems like wherever Abraham went, plagues followed. When he went down to Egypt, Pharaoh's cattle stopped multiplying. His wives stopped having children. He recognized Abraham's visit as a curse. And there's several similar stories to that. Abraham tries to intercede for Sodom, and how far did that get? Sodom is destroyed. So the idea of being a blessing to the nations, the idea of dominating the land, the idea of having many descendants, none of that was fulfilled in Abraham's life. And in fact, when you get to the very end of the book of Genesis, you have about 70 people. That's the multitude. That's the many descendants, like the sands of the sea. But at least it's a start. At many points along the narrative, it looked like it was all going to end, that there was just no descendants, there was just no security moving forward. But by the end of the story, you can see that the promise of many descendants, at least, is beginning to be fulfilled. Then, as you move ahead in Exodus and going on further, you find that the promises do get fulfilled eventually. And perhaps there's a bit of a lesson in that for us. Because I think very often in our lives we have a sense that God is pointing us in certain directions, and it never quite seems to happen very often. All right, so number 4, let's move to the Exodus. And here we'll take a look at the rest of the Pentateuch. We spent extra time in Genesis because I think that's a crucial foundation, not only for the Pentateuch, but it's also a crucial foundation for the entire Bible in many ways. But another crucial foundation is the Exodus story. The Exodus event, in a real sense, is a focal point of the entire Old Testament. Once the Exodus has occurred, it's referred to over and over and over again, and we'll see examples of that. This is also true of the New Testament. The Exodus story is a foundation of how the New Testament writers describe the cross, the Lord's Supper. It is a Passover feast. The baptism is related to the Exodus and so on. So you have much of the vocabulary of salvation in the New Testament is drawn from the Exodus story. Words like redeem, deliver, ransom, purchase, slavery, freedom, etc. In the Exodus event, God is fulfilling the promises to Abraham. The people move from a family to a nation. By the end of the Pentateuch, they are truly a nation in and of itself. The relationship with God is established as God removes the Pharaoh from the scene and brings them to himself. That relationship's established. And then, of course, the goal of the Exodus is the land of Canaan that God promised. 400 years after the promise to Abraham, finally, the people of God actually enter the land and have some reasonable expectation of thinking that the land belongs, in some sense, to them. So in the book of Exodus, the primary focus is the relationship promise. God promised to restore the relationship between the people and God that was lost in the fall. The first 18 chapters of Exodus describe how God removes Israel from its king, Pharaoh. God separates them from Pharaoh so he can bring him to his mountain, Mount Sinai, and there enter into a unique relationship to them. God is replacing Pharaoh as the king of Israel. In Exodus 19 through 24, then, the code there is ratified. God makes a covenant with the people. He grounds the relationship with them. And there they, in a sense, become married to him. It's a metaphor that's used later on quite frequently. Then comes the sanctuary in Exodus 25 through 40. And what's the purpose of the sanctuary? It's recognizing that while God has established his relationship with Israel in Exodus 19 to 24, that Israel, like most human beings, will tend to fall away, will tend to lose focus on that. And what do you do when the covenant is broken? What do you do when God has entered into relationship with a whole nation, that nation turns away from him? What can God do? And the solution is the sanctuary. And in the sanctuary, God offers provisions to maintain the covenant. When the covenant is broken, what do? Well, you bring these lambs, you go through these ceremonies, you take up these attitudes and so forth. In the sanctuary, the covenant can be re-established and put together in the way that it's supposed to be. So the book of Exodus describes the physical exodus of God's people, describes their entering relationship with God, and then receives the sanctuary as the way in which they can maintain that relationship with God. And of course, the book of Leviticus naturally follows the book of Exodus because it also focuses on those sacrifices. So the book of Leviticus continues to spell out how the relationship between God and his people could be maintained in spite of the fall, in spite of human sin. The sanctuary is a remedy for sin. What's the problem of the sanctuary? People are dirty. They need to be cleansed. People are guilty. They need acquittal. People owe God a debt. They need to bring a lamb, and then they can be forgiven. So you have the sanctuary as being like a giant metaphor of how to deal with the problem of human sin. So in the book of Leviticus, the relationship between God and the people is maintained through the sacrificial system. And one of the great themes of Leviticus is worship. And since we have mentioned worship in the previous module and how worship is associated with rehearsing the mighty acts of God, there are 4 ways that worship occurs in the book of Leviticus. One of these is through sacrifice. Another is through the feast days. Another is through the praise of God, singing psalms. And another is prayer. But the particular focus in the book of Leviticus is the sacrifices, and the feast days are the means by which God has chosen to maintain his relationship with the people. Book of Numbers continues the story of Leviticus. It continues describing sacrifices and so forth, at least through chapter 10. And then it returns to the narrative of how Israel was about to go into the promised land, how doubts come in, how they begin to question whether God has led them correctly. And you have then the tragic sentence that they're to spend a whole generation, 40 years, wandering in the wilderness. But toward the end of the book of Numbers, Israel comes to the end of the 40 years and begins invading on the east side of the Jordan, the Transjordan area, and that's where the story takes us. And Moses comes to the place where he's going to die. And so the book of Deuteronomy then is sort of like Moses' last will and testament. It's his final sermon before Israel goes into Israel proper, to the promised land. Moses prepares the way with the book of Deuteronomy, which is called second law in the Greek. If Leviticus is the first law, then Deuteronomy is the second law. The laws of Leviticus relate to the experience in the desert after the Exodus. The laws of Deuteronomy deal with what life will be like in relationship to God when they are settled in the promised land. So it's interesting how the laws of Leviticus and Deuteronomy are shaped to the context in which they are. It's a very different thing to be living in a tent, to be moving around all the time, to have a Bedouin existence. That requires one type of laws. On the other hand, Deuteronomy is about a settled condition, and the laws there are a little bit different as a result. To give you one example, in Leviticus, when they want to make a sacrifice, they simply bring it to Jerusalem, and bring it to the sanctuary, which is right in the middle of the camp. It's a matter of a few steps. And there, the requirement is that the priests and the Levites must sacrifice the animals. You see, and that's true even for food. If they are slaughtering animals for the sake of food, they are to bring it to the sanctuary. Let the priests do it. Let it be done properly by the experts who know how to do it. Well, when they get to the promised land, that's no longer realistic. I mean, if every time you wanted to have some meat, you got to take the animal 100 miles and have the priest do it and then bring it back, it would probably be green by the time you returned and not very palatable. So the rule there says go ahead and do your meat preparation where you live, but make sure you follow these rules. You see, so. Deuteronomy and Leviticus are laws that are designed for two different contexts, and that explains some of the interesting differences between them. In the book of Numbers, you start with the sanctuary, but then the story moves to the land. The focus increasingly becomes the land, and in the book of Deuteronomy, it's all about the land. So the land side of the promise to Abraham is the focus of the latter part of Numbers and also of the book of Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy is like a constitution of a new kingdom. It's how they are to respond to God's acts for them as a nation. It's a renewal of the Sinai covenant in light of a new situation. In the Deuteronomy, you have a lot of blessings and curses. You have God saying, if you do this, you'll be blessed. If you do that, you'll be under the curse. You'll have negative consequences. But Deuteronomy is focused on the nation as a whole. If the nation obeys God, it will prosper. If the nation disobeys God, it will suffer consequences. As we mentioned in Module 6, when you get to Psalms and Proverbs, you often have an individualizing of those promises. If an individual obeys, they will prosper. If they disobey, they will not. And as you know, in most circumstances of life, it isn't necessarily so. In other words, circumstances alter cases. Things are not always equal. But to the degree that things are equal, the principle of obedience does prosper one. But in Deuteronomy itself, the focus is definitely on the nation rather than on the individual.